Well, once again, good morning.
Morning.
Am I just the chair moving? I don't know, I heard a weird noise. I thought maybe there was an echo off the microphone, but we're not using a microphone, so I don't know what that would be. Okay, so this first section we're looking at is called Old Testament Promises, preparing the way for the coming of Christ. We just talked about this in 7th and 8th grade confirmation, how the Old Testament is filled with stuff about Christ. Not only times where he is included in the conversation, like when God said, "Let us make man in our image," that's a reference to the Trinity, but also in all of the promises of a Savior, starting in Genesis and all through the Old Testament, that God would send a Messiah who would redeem the world that had fallen in Adam and Eve's sin. So, from beginning to end, the Bible is all about Christ. And so we're going to start our study of the New Testament by looking back at some of the things that were said about him in the Old Testament that kind of prepared the way. So on this handout, I'll do the majority of the reading. I won't make other people read, except for the Bible verses. I'll take volunteers for that. At the time when the last books of the Old Testament were being written, which was around 400 BC, probably a little before that, the last one would have been Malachi, I think, was around 400. The other ones would have been earlier than that, actually. Malachi is beyond the other ones by almost 100 years. So that's the time frame we're looking at, about 400 BC. At that time, Israel had returned from exile, but they were still under the power of another kingdom, Persia. So even though they came back to Jerusalem, they weren't free. They were still under the authority of some other king. So if we go back to the time of the divided kingdom, when the northern kingdom of Israel kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom took the name Judah. From that time, when David's kingdom was split into two, there was a lot of trouble, I guess you could say. I want to use the word tumult, but I don't know how many people are familiar with using that word. Anyway, so that lasted for a couple hundred years, and then the kingdom of Assyria came to power and exiled the northern kingdom of Israel. They got to the doorstep of the southern kingdom, but King Hezekiah prayed, and God sent an angel through the night that wiped out the Assyrian army. 186,000 soldiers dead by the next morning, and Judah never fired a shot. So then Assyria withdrew and went back to their homeland near Nineveh. So after that, there was some period of relative peace in the southern kingdom, which was basically the areas around Jerusalem. And then Babylon came to power. And Babylon successfully conquered Jerusalem and sent them into exile around 580 BC. So from 580 till about 530, they were exiled by Babylon. And then Persia defeated Babylon. And the Persian king, whether led by God or not, told the Jews, "I don't care where you go. You can stay where you are. You can go back to Jerusalem." He wrote a letter granting them safe passage back to Jerusalem. And about 50,000 of them did return to Jerusalem and sort of start over. They went because they believed God's promises, that he would restore them as a nation. He would still send them a Messiah who had not come yet. So those faithful few, known as the remnant, returned to Jerusalem. But they were still under the authority of Persia. So that's where they were at this point. In the years to come, they would also be under the control of the Greeks and the Romans. So whoever was the world power at that time, they continued to have power over Israel. The people of Israel longed to be free. God had promised to send them a Messiah, which is the Hebrew word for king. The Greek word is Christ. So Messiah, Christ, king, they all mean the same thing, just in different languages. So God had promised to send them a Messiah who would lead them to freedom. But the freedom he promised was freedom from their real enemies, sin, death, and the devil. Now, if you read through a number of Old Testament prophets, it's clear that that's what God was promising them. That he would take away their sins, that he would take their scarlet robes and make them white as snow, all those kinds of things. So the promise, God didn't mislead them. He was going to send them a mighty king, but he never promised to set them free from their worldly enemies and powers, his promise was to set them free from sin. Those are the handouts right there, and a Bible if you want to grab them.
Thank you.
Sure. Now the next sentence says, God did not promise to set them free from worldly enemies. You know, that's still a danger for some Christians today, is they feel like God should do what they want, and that he should deliver them from whatever earthly enemies they're facing. And sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. And the hard part for us to remember is that, what did God promise? Not what do we want, what did God promise? And so there are a lot of people that get mad when God doesn't do things that they want him to do. But did he promise to do those things? No. But what he has promised to do, he continues to do. So that's what we need to remember when things don't go our way. Did God promise us we would be healed? Did God promise us we'd find a date to the prom? Did God promise us that we would live long and be rich? No, he didn't promise us any of those things. Still, that's what many people thought and hoped for. Now, we'll come back to those their false ideas later. But for now, let's look at some of the promises God made to Israel about the Messiah who was to come. So the first promise we find in Genesis 3, verse 15. And if any of the students would like to read that, you get first dibs if I see any of your hands go up. But if your hands don't go up, then I'll call on somebody else. Lucas, did you want to read 3 verse 15? Go for it.
There's no more Bible.
Oh, that would help, wouldn't it? If you have your own Bibles, you're certainly invited to bring them. Especially if you're worried about any sort of COVID stuff. Does anybody else need a Bible? Okay, give Lucas a second to look that up. While he's doing that, you'll notice there is a handout that goes with this. Some people learn more by writing stuff down, and so you're invited to do that. I have toyed with the idea of quizzing the adults at the end of each unit and just see if they've learned anything, just for fun. You're not going to get suspended and you're not allowed to come back for Bible study the next week. But I thought it might be fun. But maybe your brain doesn't work like mine. I liked taking tests in school. Maybe you don't or didn't. What do you think, Leif? Leif, you like taking tests? Nah, I didn't think so.
I don't even do actual math in my school.
You don't do actual math. That's
We don't
sorry to hear
do
that.
math problems.
Well, they're coming, I bet. Okay, go for it.
I'll put enemy.
Enmity, that's a strange word that means basically they're not going to like each other. Enmity.
I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between his offspring and her offspring. You shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
Okay, thank you. That was God talking to Satan, saying, you and human beings are going to be enemies for the rest of time. And I am going to make it so that you will he shall bruise your head, and you'll bruise his heel. So the bruising of the head is like the stomping on the head of a snake. And then the bruising of the heel, if we're going to take that somewhat literally, would refer to the crucifixion. Unlike what most people think, or what most artists depict it as, crucifixion did not take place to the top of the feet, one on top of each other and pinned through them. They were actually on the side of the cross, and it went through the sides of the heels. Very painful. That's what held the person onto the cross. So, again, if it's a reference to the crucifixion, it's a very literal one. It was his heels that were damaged. So, all right, so thank you. In Genesis 3:15, which you just heard read, God made his first promise about the Messiah. Though spoken to Satan, the promise was made to all mankind. Okay, the next promise that God made about a Messiah comes in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 4. That's a lot of reading, but if one of the students wants it, they can have it. Otherwise, I'll call on an adult. I won't call on students against their will. So, any adults want to read this?
I'll read it.
Please, thank you.
The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran.
Okay, thank you. Yep, just through 4.
Okay.
Yep, so here he is, 75 years old, and God says to this man who has no children, I'm going to give you children, and you're going to have so many children, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, you're going to turn into a mighty nation. So pretty interesting promise to make to an old man like that. This was not in the previous days where people lived to be 900 years old. This was in the days of, 100, 110, 120. So telling him this at 75 seemed ridiculous, but this was the promise God made. Now, for purposes of focusing on the Messiah, the last promise, there were sort of 4 promises, their land, kid, cattle, and salvation, is all nations. What's the exact words here again? In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So from one of your descendants, the whole world is going to be blessed. And of course we know that that's Jesus. He was one of Abraham's descendants. If you look in the New Testament, the beginning of one of the Gospels, it has the lineage from Abraham down to Jesus to show that promise had been fulfilled. All right, so in that text, God began to fulfill the promise by making a covenant with Abraham. The last of God's 4 promises made it clear that through one of Abraham's descendants, God was going to keep his promise to Adam and Eve. This is the same kind of promise that was made to David in 2 Samuel 7, verse 16. Yes.
Going back to the last verse.
Yep.
If he said that all the families of the world were going to be blessed through Abraham's descendants, why did the Jews feel that Christ only came to them?
Well, to be honest, off the top of my head, the 2 problems with their point of view was, number one, they were looking for an earthly leader, so he couldn't set the whole world free. He has to beat somebody in order to set them free. And then the second part of it is they simply didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. Their view of Messiah was very much centered on Israel alone. He will set us free. And that's all they cared about. When God said, I will make you a light to the Gentiles, it was pretty clear they were supposed to bring other people into the covenant through what we would call evangelism, but they never did it. They were very inwardly focused. When they had enemies, they didn't try to preach to them about who God was, they just defeated them. So I think it's the fault lies with the people of Israel themselves in the Old Testament, where they just never viewed things the way God did. They saw God as their God for them and no one else. Does that somewhat answer your question?
Maybe.
Well, I
That's
mean,
your view on it.
it's a great question to wonder is why didn't they view the Messiah the way God did? And I think it's because it's common to people to listen to someone talk and hear what they want to hear and pretend the rest of it didn't exist. Husbands are notorious for this when it comes to a chore list. They hear the part about you can have a beer when you're done, but they didn't hear the other stuff about what they're actually supposed to do.
Well, God did say to the Israelites that you will be my people and I will be your God.
Yep.
But here he says all the families of the world will be blessed,
Right.
not just the Jews.
Israel was the instrument through which God was going to bless the rest of the world. That's why they were his chosen ones, because he was going to use them. And sometimes in theological circles we talk about Jesus being the New Testament equivalent of Israel. So Jesus came first for the Jews, but ultimately for the whole world. But it was through Christ, the Jewish man, that God intended to save the world. So God raised up Israel and wanted to work through them to be a blessing to the whole world. And ultimately did by raising up Christ out of that Jewish lineage. But God certainly had different plans for the nations of the world in the Old Testament than what actually happened.
It just seems strange to me that based on this, that the disciples, I understood that there was a conflict in the disciples, that they wanted to only preach to the Jews, and then Paul
yes, the issue between the disciples was, do you have to be Jewish first before you can be Christian? So when they were talking to Gentiles, people who were not Jews, they were telling them, you have to follow all of the Old Testament regulations, you've got to go get circumcised. And that was the part where Paul stepped in and said, whoa, 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 no you don't. Because all those things you're talking about are law. We're not saved by law, we're saved by grace. Therefore you don't have to become Jewish before you become Gentile. And that was the first apostolic council that took place. It was a big deal, and they had to be settled. And ultimately it was Paul versus Peter, and Peter repented, and James, the brother of Jesus, was the one who was the president of the council, and he was the one who, after hearing everything, said, Paul's right, and everyone went along with it.
Okay, so they didn't really think that Christ only came to the Jews, they just thought you needed to be Jewish in order to be.
In the early church, yes. Yeah. All right, so 2 Samuel 7, verse 16. I haven't found it yet, but I'll bet some of you have. Does anybody want to read that? All right, no kids' hands are up, so any adults want to read that?
And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me.
Okay, so here's God making a promise to David that the line of David and his kingdom will be established forever. Well, of course, that's historically, it didn't happen. The line of David came to an end as far as earthly kings. But God didn't have in mind an earthly king. He had in mind Christ, the Messiah, the one true king, whose reign is from everlasting to everlasting. And so his promise to David was fulfilled, but in a theological way. One of his descendants, that is David, would be the king who ruled over all time and space, and that is our Lord Jesus Christ, who is in the line of David. Once again, if you look at the New Testament Gospels, and they give his line of ancestry, they include David in there to show God has kept his promises. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, God made a number of other promises that all pointed to the sending of a Savior. Read the following verses for a sampling of the kinds of promises that God made to his people, all of which were meant to prepare people for the day when their true king, Messiah, arrived. So let's take a look at these promises. Isaiah 7:14. Very familiar, especially around Christmas time. Someone want to read that?
Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel.
Pretty familiar promise that we read about at Christmas time. The sign would be the virgin will conceive. That's a miracle by itself. And the name of the child will be Emmanuel, which means God with us. God will come and dwell among us. What an amazing promise that was being made there. Okay, Jeremiah 23. Verses 5 and 6. Anyone? Kale, that boy. Kale's got it.
The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will rise up to David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days Judah will be saved and Israel will live in safety. This is his name by which he will be called, the Lord is our righteousness.
Okay. So this is Jeremiah. So this is while Israel and Judah, I say Israel, but really technically it's Judah, is in exile. So they're separated from the Holy Land. And the promise is that a branch of David, so in other words, one of his descendants, will be raised up by God, and he will execute justice and righteousness, and Judah and Israel will be saved. And his name will be, the Lord is our righteousness. In other words, our ability to be made right with God will be accomplished by whom? God. The Lord, Yahweh. I mean, that's the capital letters there. That's the divine name for God, Yahweh. So when you see the capital letters there for Lord, Yahweh is our righteousness. He is the way that we become right with God. Not our efforts, but His efforts. And it will happen through this descendant of David that God will raise up to be king over us. Okay, Ezekiel 34. Verses 15 and 16.
I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down desires, declares the Lord God. I will seek the wrong, and I will bring back the slave, and I will bind up the injured, and I will slacken the free, and the fat, and the small. I will destroy. I will feed them and shut.
Okay, thank you. So before you guys flip to the next one, so keep on this text for a second. Here God is promising, I will be their shepherd, and I will take care of them. Now skip ahead in that same chapter to verses 23 and 24, and notice what it says. So first of all, God says, I will be their shepherd. Then He says, I will set up over them a shepherd, my servant David. He will feed them. So God says He'll do it. Then He says He'll send a descendant of David, or His servant David, which by this time David's already dead. So clearly it's not talking about David himself, but some representative of David. So God says, I'll do it, and David will do it. The only way that makes sense is if God and this servant David are the same person, which is, we know what happened. Christ is God. Christ is man. He is descended from David. He is the earthly manifestation of David's descendants, David's throne, so to speak. So here we have God saying, I'll do it. Then He says, my servant David will do it. How is it possible that both of those can be true? Only if God is my servant David. And it goes down in the next verse, said, I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. Again, a reference to Father and Son. So here we see not only a promise about the Messiah, but also a promise about the incarnation, that Christ will be true God and true man. And we really get a sense of that when we turn to our next text in Daniel 7. And by the way, if anyone else has questions or anything, feel free to stop me. I want to make sure we get finished, so I might be pressing a little bit. I think we've got time, but that's my concern, is making sure we get through the lesson on time. But if you need me to stop, let me know. Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14.
I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed.
All right, thank you. Once more, building on the idea of the Messiah coming. So Messiah means king, and throughout here we see He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and everybody would serve Him and everybody would worship Him. And the thing that we learn about this king, once again, is His dual nature, that He is both God and man, because it says, one like a son of man came into the presence of the Ancient of Days. Now, in Trinitarian language, which one of the persons of the Trinity would be the Ancient of Days? Father, Son, or Holy Spirit?
Father.
Father, right. So here's one like a son of man led into his presence. Which member of the Trinity is most likely to be described by son of man?
Son.
The Son, Jesus. And by the way, that's a title that Jesus used for himself. A number of times he referred to himself as the Son of Man. I don't think any human being ever called him that. But Jesus did. He referred to himself in those terms. And so what do we learn about this one like a son of man? He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. And all peoples and languages would serve him. And he will have a kingdom that's everlasting. So he's God. You can't worship anybody except God. So if all the nations are falling down and serving him, he must be God. And yet he's led into the presence of the Ancient of Days, which can only point to the fact that you have God the Father, you have God the Son. They're both God as part of the mystery of the Trinity, which none of us can fully comprehend. And here is the promise that there is a king to come who is God, and all people will worship him, but he is also the king that is from David that was promised. So another promise we have. Notice that the emphasis is not on he's going to destroy the rest of the world and he's going to set Israel free. It's that he's king of the whole world. Not king of Israel as they wipe everyone else out. He's king of the whole world. And he has a kingdom that will never pass away. And finally, Micah 5, verse 2. When it comes to these minor prophets, it's hard to find them sometimes. Micah 5, verse 2. Who would like to read that, please?
But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days.
Okay, another promise about this coming Messiah. He's coming from the area of Bethlehem. Another text that we often hear a lot about at Christmas time. But not only is he coming in the future, what else do we learn about him in this text? With regard to time. He's coming in the future.
He was in the past.
And he was in the past. Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. The God who is and who was and who is to come. So here we have the eternal nature of the coming Messiah. He has been, and he's coming. Again, a reference there to the nature of Christ. And this is the one who has been promised is coming. Obviously, there are other texts that we could look at. Those are just a sampling. Let's go back to the handout here. While the Jews were waiting for Messiah to come, some of them became impatient. They tried to raise up messiahs for themselves, with the hope that God would bless them and set them free from the nations which controlled them. There were times in the Old Testament where God had made promises to people, but they couldn't wait. So they tried to fulfill the promises on their own. This is an example of that, where they would raise up their own powerful leaders and just assume if we did our part, God will do the rest, which is not at all how it works. God says, I will do it. You just sit there and believe. Anyhow, so they raised up messiahs for themselves. The most famous of these were the Maccabees. And this was around the year 166 BC, so about 166 years before Christ was born. At that time, I think it was the Greeks who were in charge of the Holy Land, and the Maccabees were a family. I'll just read it here. They were a family of warrior priests, and for a brief time they led a successful rebellion against the Greeks. For a small period of time, Jerusalem was completely free. They had driven out all of their enemy occupiers, and the only people in Jerusalem were themselves, the Jews, and they ruled themselves. Now, just briefly about the Maccabees, a couple of things. Number one, the history of the Maccabees, if you were at all curious about this period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when the Maccabees led the people of Israel in battle and victory, there's two books in the Apocrypha. Again, if you remember what the Apocrypha is, it's some books that are not inspired by God, but they're helpful to read anyway, written during the time between the Old Testament and New Testament. Catholic Bibles consider them to be at least somewhat inspired. So a Catholic Bible actually has these 12 books in their Bibles. We don't. So if you ever find a Bible that has 1st and 2nd Maccabees in it, that was created to be a Catholic Bible. But if you are curious and you don't have a Catholic Bible, I have two different versions of the Apocrypha up here. You can take them home and read about the Maccabees if you're interested. Now, one other thing that is useful, I suppose, is when the Maccabees finally won their battle, it was in part due to a miracle. They only had enough oil in their lamps for one day, and yet God, at least this is how the story goes, God enabled those lamps to burn for 8 days. So they didn't run out of oil. They were able to continue doing whatever they needed to do to defeat the Greeks. Miraculously, for 8 days, their lamps burned. That miracle is commemorated still today with a Jewish holiday. Does anybody know what that holiday is called? If you're an Adam Sandler fan, you might know what it is. Kale? Hanukkah. Yes. So when you see the celebration of Hanukkah, it's celebrating the victory of the Maccabees, setting Jerusalem free. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there as a little bit of trivia, so to speak, so now you know what Hanukkah is all about. Okay, next page. The Greeks were defeated by the Romans, and the Maccabees couldn't defeat the Romans in part because some of the Jewish leaders made a deal with the Romans. There was actually two sort of rivals for power in Israel. One of them said, let's fight them and let's stay free. The other one said, we can't beat them, so let's join them. And that's what happened, is this one group of Jews made a deal with the Romans. We will work against our own people to let you in. By the way, there was a lot of friction after that between the Jews. That's a whole other story, but obviously it didn't make some of them real happy. But they worked against their own people for the Romans. The benefit of that was that the Jewish leaders promised to help the Romans if the Romans promised to go easy on Israel. Once the Maccabees were destroyed, Israel was once again under the control of another nation, which was Rome. However, an alliance had been formed between the Jews and the Romans, and that alliance continued through the life of Christ, although it did begin to crumble towards about the time Jesus ascended. There were definitely some cracks in that relationship that would eventually splinter in the 60s AD. But for this period of time, there was a relative alliance between Rome and Israel. And Israel did have perks that other conquered nations didn't have. And I think this is written out here, so I'll just read it. In the coming years, the Romans would allow the Jews to select their own leaders and enjoy other freedoms that other conquered nations didn't have. At the time of Jesus' birth, Israel was under the control of Rome, but they had a Jewish king, and his name was Herod. We all know about King Herod. How did they have a king of their own if they're under Roman control? Because Rome allowed Israel to have their own rulers, but those rulers were still under Rome. They still had to do what the Romans said, but at least it helped the Jews to feel like they were under a Jewish king and not a Roman emperor. So that helped pacify some of them. Some of them hated Herod because they saw him as a puppet of the Roman Empire, and assassination attempts were attempted on him. And obviously the Romans themselves, the Zealots, if you're familiar with that term, was a group of Jews who, I guess you could call them freedom fighters. I think they were misguided, but nonetheless, they were trying to set Israel free from Rome, and that was a pointless attempt because Rome was too powerful. So anyway, there was definitely friction there for a while, and eventually Jerusalem and the Jews rebelled against Rome, and Rome wiped them out. And that was again in 60, it started in 66 AD is when that war started. And in 70 AD it was finished when they burned down most of Jerusalem, including the temple. And that was the end of the temple. But we'll probably talk about that another time. For hundreds of years, the people of Israel waited for God to keep his promise and send them a Savior, the Messiah, who would set them free from their real enemies and rule over them forever. Next unit, we'll talk about how those promises came true. Any questions or comments? If not, the students have their own sort of work that they can, they have to turn in to Kevin. Adults, if you want to fill that stuff in to help it stick in your brain better, you're certainly welcome to do that as well. If nothing else, I figure I've got about 5 minutes before I've got to go get robed up and everything. Anything else that you'd like to talk about? I know Lois has got to go get ready. Well, I don't want them back, so you can keep it and toss it or frame it, whatever you want to do. For what it's worth, as long as no one else is talking, I'll keep talking. In that time period, in the 60s, 66 to 70 AD, they did raise up another Messiah for themselves, and they felt like if we get behind him, he, with God's help, will defeat the Romans. Not only did it not happen, but there was a segment of Jews who said, we want nothing to do with this battle. Which Jews do you think wanted nothing to do with this battle because they knew that this Messiah was a false one?
They were the Christian Jews, weren't they?
Christian Jews. Jewish people that had become Christians said, we're not going to follow this guy. Messiah's already come. This is a false Messiah. This isn't going to work. And so after that, there was a lot of hatred towards Christians. I mean, there already was between Jews and Christians, but it really got ramped up after that because they refused to fight alongside their brothers and sisters, so to speak. And so when they lost that war, a lot of them blamed the Jewish Christians for it. Meanwhile, Rome, on the other hand, had for a while now viewed Jews and Christians the same. They didn't recognize any difference. They figured Christians are just a branch of Judaism. You're all Jews. And because Rome and the Jews had a fractured relationship, Rome went after the Christians as well as the Jews. But there were a lot more Jewish Christians and then Gentile Christians in the other Roman lands. So when we talk about the Christian persecutions, part of it is because they were thought to be Jews. And another part of it was they were told to worship Roman gods, and they couldn't do it because they knew who the true God was. Now, for what it's worth, one more thing. In the 1800s, I think it was 1800s, there was another Messiah that was raised up by the people themselves. And I know this seems hard to believe. 1800 years after Christ had died, rose again, and ascended, they were still looking for a Messiah, still waiting for one to come. And they thought they had one. And with the ability of printing press and, technology had improved to the point where word could spread far and wide that there was a Messiah in Israel and he was going to lead them. A number of Jewish people came back to Israel in the 1800s because they thought this was the one that they were waiting for. And actually they were at war at that time with Muslims. And the Messiah that they were following got captured by the Muslims. And during his imprisonment, guess what he did? He converted, became Muslim. And after that, the Jews were so disillusioned, they've stopped waiting for Messiah. They gave up. They waited all that time, and they finally had one they believed in, and he let them down. So now, when you talk with Jewish people, assuming that you ever have the opportunity to do that, there's three branches of Judaism. Two of them don't even believe in a Messiah. One of them doesn't even believe in God. That's how damaged their faith was, because they were putting their faith in the wrong things, and then it turned out it didn't work out for them. You've got the Orthodox Jews who still believe the Old Testament stuff, but they think now there's not really a Messiah coming. They're waiting for a Messianic age when things will be better and different. But they have given up waiting for a Messiah, although they did acknowledge the existence of one, or that there should have been one. And then you've got Reformed and conservative Jews who basically say, there is no Messiah, we're not waiting for one, it's never going to happen, and they've completely given up hope. So, anyway, there you go. There's your history lesson, I suppose. Thank you for being here today, and God's blessings to you, and hopefully you'll stick around for church.